What's up, everybody? Matt Gajewski here, back again, talking college football DFS. We are talking the Friday slate, 2 games, and I can't wait to get into it. But before we get started, hit the thumbs up button, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell so you know when this and all other content goes live, including our college football live before locks. And of course, we will be taking you behind the glass a little bit during this video, showing you what we have to offer at Awesemo. And today, the big slate write-up is free, so make sure to check that out. But we have everything: ownership projections, regular projections, slate write-ups, depth charts, everything you could possibly need. But let's dive into this 2-game slate, tell you everything you need to know about these teams. In the first game, we have UCF, Central Florida, taking on Louisville. An enormous total in this game, 68.5. UCF is the 7-point favorite here, and there's a lot to get to. With UCF, where we will start, you have now begun the Gus Malzahn era. They have wins over Boise State, which was barely a win. They had to come from behind in that game. And then they beat Bethune-Cookman. So far, they've actually retained their up-tempo pace that we saw with Heupel. They're running 88 plays per game. They did that against Boise State. They're fairly balanced with a 45% pass rate. And there's a lot to like on this team as far as returning production. They do pace the entire slate in team total. So we want to target UCF. And it begins with Dillon Gabriel, who is actually a bit underpriced in this spot, 8,600, a dude that projects easily for 300 yards passing. He's already averaging 315 per game, completing 65.8% of his passes, and he has some rushing upside. He's a guy that already has 107 rushing yards on the year, so he's been above 30 rushing yards in his first 2 games. It's interesting because Gabriel only has 2 career games above 30 yards in his 2 years as the starter before that. But he is running a little bit, and he will be a positive on the ground, which is something you like. In the backfield, we saw Isaiah Bowser handle a bell cow workload in week 1 against Boise State, 32 carries. The only other running back that carried the ball was Johnny Richardson, just 4 attempts for him. One thing to note was that Shirley Coles was suspended for the game. He did come back and play in their second game, handle 11 attempts, and he is going to be a factor in the backfield. We just don't know how much. It appears Bowser, with this role as the bell cow, tentatively is one of the better price-adjusted plays on the slate. He already has 229 rushing yards on the year. He's a decent pass catcher, 6 targets for another 33 yards. Bowser is going to be the top running back play on the board today, price-adjusted. In the receiver room, you have 3 clear starters in Brandon Johnson, Ryan O'Keefe, and Jalen Robinson. Jalen Robinson actually is 3rd on the team in targets right now with 13. You have Brandon Johnson and O'Keefe tied for the team lead at 16. But Johnson, he is the lowest in overall receiving yards, just 128 for him. Whereas you have Jalen Robinson, the team leader, at 187. He was the leading returner among receivers this year. So the pricing does make sense with Jalen Robinson being number 1, Ryan O'Keefe being number 2 at 63, and then Brandon Johnson at 5K. He's your best price-adjusted play. All of these guys are almost identical in routes run, so you can pick and choose any of the 3 for your stacks with Dillon Gabriel. It's probably a good idea to get 1, if not 2 here. They're not using a tight end as much as they did last year, so I would ignore almost everybody else in the offense, including like a Jake Hescock. None of them are really worth targeting here, just basically the big 3. On the other side, Louisville still has an enormous implied team total themselves, even though they're 7-point underdogs, and it begins with dual threat quarterback Malik Cunningham, who comes in really cheap on this slate as well, 7,600. In most builds, you're going to be playing both of these quarterbacks, but as we'll get to, there's something to like in the Maryland-Illinois game as well. But these are your top 2 quarterbacks. Cunningham hasn't been as efficient this year. It makes sense. He lost his top 3 skill position players in Javian Hawkins, Des Fitzpatrick, and Tutu Atwell. But we still like what this Louisville team is doing. They're pretty fast. They pass a lot, especially right now. That's because Ole Miss put them in negative game script. But you're going to see a fairly balanced Louisville team. They're around on average to above average in plays per game. All of that bodes well for Cunningham, who has been quietly fairly efficient, 62% completion percentage, 7.8 yards per attempt. Again, there's just going to be a little bit of growing pains for Louisville because of all of the turnover they had on offense at the skill position players. At running back, Jalen Mitchell has emerged as the lead rusher. He's also pretty cheap. And in the first game, we saw him handle most of the work. Hassan Hall mixed in for 5 carries, Trevion Cooley for 3. And it will be a little more of a timeshare. It's just you're going to have Mitchell handling most of the work. It's interesting here because he's not as much of a pass catcher as like Isaiah Bowser on the other side. That may or may not be intended. I think Cunningham just going to scramble a little bit more than Dillon Gabriel. But Mitchell is a fine price-adjusted play at 4,900. He's averaging 69.5 yards per game. The receivers for Louisville have been a complete disaster to start the year. And not a disaster as in unproductive, but just difficult to predict. The player who's actually on the field the most is their tight end, Marshawn Ford, who's the only player that's eclipsed 70% of the team's routes run in the first 2 games. He's 3,500 and a solid price-adjusted play in these stacks, in a run back, anything you want to do in the game. From there, Tyler Harrell is actually running the second most routes, but he only has 8 targets and 20 receiving yards on the year. A little bit of a buy low. If you want to look at week 1, which was their more competitive game, Jordan Watkins did lead the team in routes run that week. He was just behind Ford, but he did participate in 62% of the routes run. In the second week, that dropped to 44%, but not as competitive of a game. He has 6 targets on the year, potential buy low as well. Amari Huggins-Bruce is leading the team with 11 targets overall, but he has yet to eclipse 44% of the routes in either game. And from there, you have players like Josh Johnson, Braden Smith, Justin Marshall, all mixing in as well. It's going to be a 6-man rotation with the clearest path to targets being tight end Marshawn Ford. From there, I like Jordan Watkins and Tyler Harrell, but you could play almost anybody, including Amari Huggins-Bruce and Josh Johnson in your GPPs. Only a 2-game slate, so in big tournaments, you want to differentiate with some of these players. But this is the game you clearly want to look to. It is the enormous total, but that doesn't mean we want to ignore the second game. There's a lot of solid targets in Maryland taking on Illinois too, which is where we will go to next. This game has a 60.5 total, so still pretty good. Maryland, a 34-point implied team total because they are 7.5-point favorites. That gives them the second highest implied team total on the board. They're slightly ahead of Louisville. And Taulia Tagovailoa is another solid play. He's not going to rush as much as Malik Cunningham, but he's been very efficient through the air, basically in every game of his career outside of his debut against Northwestern, where he failed to eclipse 100 yards. But he's throwing 30.5 times per game, averaging 295 yards. A lot of that coming from the West Virginia shootout we saw in week 1. But Illinois' defense doesn't scare you, and they're already a little banged up. This Maryland team, they play with pace, and they're fairly pass-heavy. They're going to be slightly above average in pass rate, just below 50%, but we've seen them go very pass-heavy at times. Last year, they passed 54% of the time. This year, they're just down a little bit, likely because of their week 2 game against Howard. Now, we talked Taulia Tagovailoa. He's a good option. He's going to project a little bit worse than Cunningham because of dual threat ability, but in tournaments, Taulia Tagovailoa is something you certainly want to consider, especially with the second highest team total. In the backfield, they are undergoing a little bit of a shift. Tayon Fleet-Davis is the lead back right now, and he's going to split time somewhat with Isaiah Jacobs and now Penny Boone, who came back from a concussion he had in the preseason. So Tayon Fleet-Davis, tentatively, somebody you can target. I would rather get down to like a Jalen Mitchell. I would rather get up to an Isaiah Bowser, but you got to play at least 2 running backs. So Tayon Fleet-Davis is solid price-adjusted play. You just are a little bit curious about how the backfield shakes out now that Isaiah Jacobs is back from his turf toe. Could have played last week, but they held him out against Howard, precautionary. And Penny Boone, a bigger back, maybe their goal line back. But I would still say Tayon Fleet-Davis tentatively the lead back. Just not sure how this shakes out. More GPP plays. In the receiving room, we have 2 clear alphas in Dante Demas and Raheem Jarrett. Raheem Jarrett is arguably the best price-adjusted receiver on the entire slate. He has a 23.5% target share. Demas at 25%. Again, a lot of this depressed by the fact that they played Howard in week 2. Both of them averaging absurd numbers receiving. Demas is at 130.5 yards per game. Raheem Jarrett, 94. You could see those flip-flop at any point in time. Demas has a 1-target lead on Jarrett right now. They went for 9 and 7 targets in the opener. They're going to rotate the wide receiver 3 spot between Jayshon Jones, Daryl Jones, and Brian Cobbs. I think if you're looking to one of them, it's probably Daryl Jones, who has run the most routes of the group, but just it's going to be a little tough to rely on one of them. They're GPP targets. And then Chigo Okonkwo, their tight end, he's been a red zone weapon, only 4 targets, but he already has 2 touchdowns. He's on the field quite a bit, so he's somebody you could maybe look to in tournaments as well. He's run a route, at least in week 1, he ran a route on 90% of the dropbacks, and then in week 2, they barely tried against Howard. They didn't need to, so Chigo Okonkwo should be somewhere in between the 90% of dropbacks he was participating in and then what he did against Howard in week 2. So he's a solid GPP play as well. Really, really cheap. On the Illinois side, easily the lowest implied team total. Somewhat of a quarterback controversy. If Brandon Peters back from injury, do they stick with him? Do they put Sitkowski in if he struggles? Neither have been particularly good. Peters actually has some rushing upside. Not a lot. He's more like Taulia Tagovailoa, but the negative 15 yards on the year, he's typically not doing that. It's just occasionally he'll take some sacks. But Peters, he is the worst target on the slate for quarterbacks, viable in GPPs only. And that's all I'll really say about the Illinois passing situation. They're a run-heavy team unless they get down in games, which they have often this year. They're 1-2. In the backfield, Mike Epstein is hurt. Chase Brown has kind of emerged from the doghouse. This is still likely going to be a 3 or 4-man committee with players like Josh McCray, Jakari Norwood, Chase Hayden, Reggie Love, all mixing in. Tentatively, Chase Brown would be the best play based on what he showed last year, but really difficult situation to target for Illinois as a touchdown underdog with the lowest implied team total and a potential 4-man committee that we haven't seen. Like Tony Peterson, the offensive coordinator, just hasn't relied on one back, except with Epstein in week 1. Just difficult situation to look to. In the receiving room, we do have a clear alpha in Isaiah Williams. This dude has a 31% target share. He has 31 targets already on the year and 183 receiving yards. He just won't be as efficient as Jarrett and Demas and the UCF receivers, but the volume is there. And he's also active in the run game. 2 carries in their first matchup. He's a former quarterback, so you could see Williams involved here. From there, you have Casey Washington, Donnie Navarro. These are going to be lower upside guys, but they're the wide receiver 3 and 4. Brian Hightower should be back in this game, somebody to watch. He's a receiver that was expected to start for this team. I would imagine he pushes Donnie Navarro off the field. But again, watch Brian Hightower in pregame warmup, somebody you can maybe look to in GPPs. Daniel Barker's the tight end. He's often targeted, low upside though, just 30 yards per game for him. He's going to be more of your around the line of scrimmage guy. But that will do it for us today. Thank you guys for watching. Of course, on the way out, hit the thumbs up button. Let me know in the comments your favorite play on the slate. Would love to hear it. And stick around. Make sure to check out all our college football content. Head over to the site, see what we have going on there. We'll greatly appreciate it. Otherwise, thank you guys and have a good day.